of God. Thanks be to God. Please be seated.
One of the names that you sometimes hear tossed around in seminaries is the name Jehoiakim Jeremias. He was a leading New Testament theologian until his death a few years ago. He was one of the leading voices, and still his works continue to influence young pastors and ministers who are going into the ministry. Not long ago, I ran across an experience that he had that I think has special meaning for us this morning on this All Saints Sunday. Jeremias was the son of German missionaries in Israel. And needless to say, when Hitler and the Third Reich came to power, the relationship between the German people and the Jewish people became extremely strained and hostile. And so Jeremias' family left Israel. Years later, after World War II and the Holocaust ended, Jeremias decided to go back to Israel. He wanted to see if there was anybody there who remembered him, and even more, he wanted to see if the Jewish people would be able to forgive him for being German. He said, I knocked on door after door, but there was no one. But then he came to this one house, and when the man answered it, he immediately recognized the man. He said, I am Jehoiakim Jeremias. Do you remember me? And the man did remember him. And he invited him in to spend some time with him. They shared some casual conversation, and then his Jewish host said to him, it is good that you have come at this time. We are celebrating the Feast of the Tabernacles. Come into our backyard. And so they went into the backyard, and in the backyard was a booth. It consisted of a brush arbor that had some fruit hanging down from it, and there was a little doorway through which the family would enter, and once inside the booth, they would recall the stories of Israel's wandering in the wilderness. Well, as Jeremias and his host entered through that little door, Jeremias noticed that there were pieces of paper on each side of the door, and on each of the pieces of paper, there were some words written in Hebrew. And so Jeremias asked his host, he said, what are those? And the host said, well, those words are a summary of Psalm 139. And Jeremias said, I don't understand. And his Jewish host said, well, the words on the left are the words from God, and the words on the right are the words to God. And then he added this comment. He said, in between, we live from God to God. Well, in our lesson this morning, we read of the vision that John the Revelator captured of the New Jerusalem. The book of Revelation is a strange book. It's full of apocalyptic literature, and it has some strange images and even some frightening pictures to some people. But then as you come to the 21st chapter, there is this picture of the New Jerusalem, of that day when all things are brought into fulfillment, that day when death will be no more. There will be no more pain, no more crying, no more sorrow. It will all have passed away. And right in the middle of this image, we hear Christ boldly proclaiming, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. Now, what's behind those words? Well, as you undoubtedly know, the words Alpha and Omega are the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet. And in a very real way, I think that when Jesus is saying, I am the Alpha and the Omega, he is saying something very similar to what Jehoiakim Jeremias heard from his Jewish host. How so? Well, at least part of what I think Christ is trying to get us to see when he says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, is that whether we realize it or not, all of life is lived from God. Christ stands at the very beginning of everything. He is our Alpha. You remember those words that are found in the first chapter of the Gospel according to St. John? in the beginning was the Word, the Logos, the Christ. And the Word was with God. And the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him. And without him, not one thing came into being. In other words, Christ not only stands at the very beginning of everything, but he is the source of all that is good and holy and right. Take our external world or creation itself as an example. You won't be able to do it today. They're expecting more rain this afternoon that will probably go into the night and last on into tomorrow. But sometime in the next couple of days, when the rain clears and the clouds disappear and the sun sets and the sky is full of stars, go outside and just look up and spend a few minutes looking at the stars. And as you're doing that, ponder a few ideas. Ponder the idea that scientists tell us or estimate that our universe is 15 billion years old. Ponder the fact that they estimate that there are within the universe what they call supercluster complex of galaxies. And these supercluster complexes of galaxies have a diameter that is billions of light years in distance. Now, to try and wrap your mind around that just a little bit, remember this, that the speed of light travels at 186,000 miles per second. The moon is 1.3 light seconds away from the earth. And the sun is 8.3 light minutes away from the earth. And the scientists estimate that some of these supercluster complex of galaxies are billions of light years in diameter. And then ponder this. Ponder that all of this is held together in such a wonderful balance that all that is made possible. And Christ said, I was at the beginning of it all. Of course, Christ stands not just at the beginning of our external world. Christ also stands at the beginning of our internal, or what you might call our spiritual world. Back some time ago, I was at a luncheon, and we had a speaker at the luncheon, and he had just come back from a mission trip to Brazil, and he told of some of his experiences. And one of the things he told about was meeting a little boy that was about 5 or 6 years of age, just about that tall. And he said, as soon as this little boy and I met, you could just tell that there was this instant connection between the two of us. He said neither one of us knew the language of the other, but there was between us this kind of instant connection. And so he said that, you know, as the week went on, he said every time we bumped into each other, he said I would, in an appropriate way, hug him and say, Michael, I love you. Michael, I love you. And he said when the week ended and it was time for me to go home, he said this little boy came running up to me and threw his arms around my legs. And he said he wouldn't let go. And he said, you know, he began to cry and I began to cry. And we both understood this love that was shared between us. And he said, and to think it all began with a hug. Well, sort of. Actually, it all began with a God who created each of us with a soul and the capacity to love and be loved. Christ said, I am the Alpha, I am the beginning, I am the source of all that is good and holy and right. And the reason it is important for us to remember this is because God has created each one of us in such a way that there is a way that it is best to live, and there is a way that it is best not to live. In the sunset years of his life, the late Leslie Weatherhead made an interesting comment that relates to all of this. Leslie Weatherhead had already served more than 40 years as the senior pastor of the City Temple Church, the renowned City Temple Church in London. He was an acclaimed author in his retirement and an international speaker. And this was the comment that he made. He said, if someone were to ask me what I have learned most clearly in all of those years, he said, I would know without hesitation what my answer would be. It would be this, that there is only one way to live, and that is God's way. All other ways are dead ends. So part of what I think Christ was trying to get us to see when he said, I am the Alpha, is that he is the source of all that is good and holy and right. And life is best lived when it is lived from an awareness of that reality. The other thing I think he was trying to get us to see when he said, I am the Omega, is that whether we realize it or not, all of life is lived toward God. Life is not just one meaningless chronological event after another, and then someplace off at the end, it ends in oblivion. It is headed somewhere. It is headed toward Christ. He is our Omega. Now, I know, sometimes it's hard to believe that. When you turn on the news and there is a story about a random storm that hit a random city and many lives were lost and the city was destroyed and now many more people are homeless and suffering, or when you pick up the newspaper and you read about a young girl who is bright and beautiful and kind and wouldn't hurt a flea, and that she was violated in unspeakable ways, or when you hear of a young man that was gunned down because of the color of his skin, or maybe when someone you love dies and you're sitting in an All Saints service like this, waiting for the name to be read. Sometimes you can wonder, where is life headed? I know it can be discouraging sometimes, but every now and then we're reminded, aren't we? This last week, I was in a district meeting. All of our clergy were in the district meeting. Tom Long, the well-known preacher and teacher of preachers, was speaking, and he was leading, and he told of one of the students that he had at Candler School of Theology, a young man who grew up on a border town in Canada. And the young man told him, he said, you know, the winters there on that border town near Canada were brutal and very harsh. And he said, in the middle of our town where we lived, we had this thermometer, this big thermometer. And he said throughout most of the winter, the thermometer reading was well below the freezing level. But he said as the winter wore on and spring began to near, he said there would always come a day when the sun would shine brightly. And he said that thermometer would rise. Sometimes it would only rise just above the freezing level. And he said, and then as the sun would recede and the shadows would fall and it would begin to get cold again, it would go back down. And he said, maybe not even to return to that height again for several more weeks. But he said, those of us in the town, we were always glad to see it go above that freezing mark, because he said, we knew that it was a sign of where we were headed. Dear friends, Christ came. Christ died, Christ arose, and Christ will come again. And that is our sign that the end towards which we are headed is good and holy and right. And the moment when you really dare to believe that, not just with your head, but with your heart as well, that is the moment when you will find the confidence and the courage and the hope to live today as if that end that is coming has already arrived. And that, my dear brothers and sisters, is the good news.